All right. So in this section, let's just quickly go ahead and look at a section that I like to call cleaning the dataset. Right? So from the first, from the so before we have already noted that the default label, the default column, we don't necessarily need it. So in this case, I'm simply going to drop it, right? So I'm going to drop it both in my training dataset and my test dataset. So I'm simply going to drop the columns. So I'll use this drop columns. So in this case, I'm going to drop the default. Then I'm going to say in place is equals to true, just to align my data frame back to normal, right? So in this case, I'm going to drop this column because we have already seen that it's not going to help us much since the data is already skewed. So I'll also drop from our testing data. So remember, we have both train and testing data that we've already imported from Cargo. So in this case, I'm going to drop these two, and I'll simply run it. Right. So once you've dropped these two, another cleanup that I need to do here is in my data set, there might be data that might have some now data set, right? So those now data set, we don't want that kind of data because that will mess up with our model, right? So I'm just simply going to drop it. So the way I'm going to drop it again is I'm going to use the pandas drop NA, right? Which is drop nuns, right? So in this case, I'm simply going to say df train dot drop none along the axis of 0. So what this does is it's going to look across all these rows, right, of our data, and then it's going to look for the now data. So if there's anything that is now, that whole row is going to be dropped, right? So that's what I'm simply doing here. So then I'll also drop anything that is none in our testing set, right? So in this case, I'm simply going to say testing, right? And then I'll save it to testing. So if there's anything here that is none, I'm simply going to drop it. So luckily with our data set, we did not have any nuns. So anyway, it's just something that you need to make sure that you do whenever you are preparing your data set, right? So the next thing that I probably need to do here now is I now need to separate my features and my label data set, right? So first of all, I'm simply going to say extract the labels here, right? So remember, in our data set, we had, so for example, if we look at the head again of this data set, you can actually see that we still have our y label that we are trying to predict, right? So we can't put this y in our training data set because we don't want it to know this outcome, right? So we need to separate the features and then the labels, right? So the way I'm going to do it here is I'm simply going to say train data, right? I'm simply going to say train data. So in this case, I'm going to change my data frame to train data. Is equals to the df train dot drop, right? So in this case, I'm going to drop the our label, right? Then I will drop the whole column, right, along the y-axis, right? So in this case, I'm going to drop the whole column called y, right, inside my data frame, and then this data frame I've saved it to a new data frame called train data. So for example, if I run this, right, let's just take a look at the train data, for example. So let's look at train data. So inside this train data, we're expecting to see that the head has been dropped, right? So as you can see, the head is no longer there, right? So what I'll simply do now is I now need to save the label now. So the train underscore labels, right? I'm going to save it from the original data frame because this original data frame still has that y label, right? So I'm simply going to say y here, right? So if I run this, right, what it means here is if I say train labels, right, I now expect to see that I now have my labels, the no's and the yes inside this data frame called train labels, right? So this is now our label. We have extracted it from our data set. So remember, our new training data set is now called train data instead of df train. So I've renamed it, I've saved it whatever here, when I dropped it, it will create the new data frame without this y, and then I've saved it to train data. So the train data is now our new data frame, right? So we need to do the same for our test labels. So let's just quickly go ahead and do that. So I'll say test data, then I'll say df testing, right? I'm simply going to drop the y, and I'll drop along the y-axis, right? And then I'll say test labels is equals to df training, which is df testing actually, which was the original one. Then I'll save it in this test label, right? So from this point, we can actually see that we now have our train labels and our test labels, and we have already printed it here. You can actually see that it has extracted our data frames successfully. In the next segment, we now want to perform what we call feature engineering. So I'll see you in the next one.